Hello, everybody, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted collectively and collaboratively by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's Center for Writing and Learning Support in the Barbour Library. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm the director of the Center for Writing and Learning Support here at the seminary. Along with my Barbour Library colleagues, Director Michelle Spomer and User Services Librarian Tisha Wu, I'd like to say how glad we are that you are here in person, those of you who are in the room, and online for those who are with us on Zoom, to celebrate this new book by our guest, local author and editor, Dr. Ed Simon. Please be aware we are recording this event and it will be available for viewing on the Book Talks page of the PTS website and on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks as soon as Bobby's had a chance to process it. Today I'll be in conversation with Ed about his new book, Binding the Ghost, Theology, Mystery, and the Transcendence of Literature, published in 2022 by Fortress Press. In a moment, I'll introduce Ed further, but as always, we have a few more announcements to make before the conversation begins. First, those of you who are on Zoom can check in your chat window for links to the PTS Book Talk page and to Amazon and bookshop.org where you can purchase Ed's book. So be sure to look in the chat. Next, for just a moment, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Tisha Wu, my colleague here in the Barbour Library, to tell those of you online and in person about a resource that the library staff has developed to support exploring Ed's work and other related.
Thank you and welcome. And for those of you who have been to Book Talk before, you've heard my spiel, but we do put together a select group of resources related to every book talk that we host. So for Ed Simon's talk today, we have a LibGuide that features his biography, his book, and links to a lot of the other work he's done. I'm sure Shan will go into the various ways that you've produced your work, but he's very, very well written in many venues online and in print, and so you can find links to all of that there. I've perused a few of his articles, and they're many topics, lots of different things he talks about. Wonderful to read, so I hope you'll take advantage of that. As well, we also list books in our collection that kind of go along with similar themes as to the book that we're discussing today. So that is also in the chat. But if you go to guides.pts.edu and go to the section on library events, you'll find him there as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Tisha. And also, again, thanks to Tisha and Michelle Spomer, our director, who could not be here this evening. They've done a lot to make this happen, including a reception for those of you who are in the room, setting up the space, and all that kind of stuff. So we're really pleased to be here in the library and appreciate the opportunity. I'd like to also thank Holly McKelvey, the Writing Center's administrative assistant, who registered all of you, helped us get the word out in various ways, as well as our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who are owed a debt of gratitude for the publicity that they did for this event and for all the Book Talks events. They do a great job, and we really appreciate them. And a special thanks again to Bobby Jarsulik and the entire phenomenal IT department, who really are just amazing. Bobby's behind the scenes right now. And those of you who are online, if you have any tech difficulties, you can always write it in the chat. Bobby will be monitoring. Also, those online, if you have questions you'd like to ask Ed, you can put them in the chat, and Bobby will voice those for you so that Ed will have a chance to answer your questions. So after I formally introduce Ed, I'll ask him to read a few pages from his book, which I don't always do first, and sometimes not at all if the author doesn't really want to read from their book. But I asked Ed to because I think there's a particular chapter that our crowd will resonate with quite a bit. And after he does that, I'm going to ask some opening questions. But I'd like to say to those of you here and online, as all of this is going on, please come up with your own questions. And we'll try to be fluid. And when you have a question, for those in the room, we actually have a microphone up here. We'd like for you to come forward so that people online can hear. And then those online, again, Bobby will voice this for you. We encourage audience participation, so please don't hesitate if you have something, even a small question you want to ask Ed. One more quick note for those of you who are on Zoom. You'll see a live transcription button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to read along with us in addition to listening. So now let me formally introduce Ed, who I've known for a while, mostly online, really through Facebook and other means for a long time, many years, but we've just started to get to know each other really through Zoom meetings and so forth, and then now this is our first time to meet in person. And Ed, I have to tell you, I was looking over your bio and I was like, wow, you've done a lot. He's the executive director of Belt Media Collaborative and the editor-in-chief of Belt Magazine, and a contributing editor for the History News Network, and a staff writer for The Millions, which the New York Times has called the indispensable literary site. In addition to publishing essays in a wide range of magazines, like Tisha said, and newspapers, including The Atlantic, the Paris Review Daily, Washington Post, Newsweek, McSweeney's, and the New York Times, amongst many others, Ed is the author of several books, including An Alternative History of Pittsburgh, which is actually a bestseller from what I understand, which is so cool. And you can find it in a lot of bookstores here in Pittsburgh for those of y'all who are interested. It's a lovely little book. And Pandemonium, A Visual History of Demonology, for those who might be interested, a work of illustrated nonfiction released by Abrams. He's also written a history of apocalypticism for MIT Press, and Elysium, an illustrated history of angelology from Abrams. You really, you hit it both, really. As well as a short book entitled Relic from Bloomsbury. A native of Pittsburgh, Ed has recently toured the East Coast, living in New York City, Boston, Washington, D.C., and now back in his hometown again. He holds a PhD in English from Lehigh University, but you, this crowd in particular, will be interested to note that he took a class here at PTS a few years ago. He studied Hebrew here, and we hopefully will have some time to ask you about that, because I'm curious.
I earned that B-.
He's taught college instruction for 15 years in disciplines such as English literature and composition, journalism, rhetoric, religious studies, and political science. You've really covered the gamut there. At institutions including local schools, Point Park University, and Duquesne. Starting next year, he's joining the faculty here at PTS as an instructor in our new doctoral program, the Creative Writing and Public Theology program. So he'll be teaching next year, which I'm thrilled about. In addition to his writing, Ed has worked as a film consultant since 2022, has been a member of the board of Autumn House Press, which is a local Pittsburgh-based nonprofit publisher of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. Wow, that's an incredible bio, Ed. I loved it.
You.
I was like, wow.
It's a lot of coffee.
A lot of coffee, staying up late at night.
Exactly.
Never able to sleep, so I just wrote.
Exactly.
Yeah. So today we're talking about Ed's book, Binding the Ghost, which on the back cover, the author, is it Briallen Hopper?
I think it is. Yeah,
Briallen Hopper?
Yeah. How you pronounce it?
Okay, well, I wasn't sure, but I was hoping I was saying it right. Briallen Hopper calls the book incantatory, a book that conjures up a world where literature and mysticism meet. This is super exciting to me. Where prayer is poetry and poetry is prayer. So I thought it'd be interesting to start off with a chapter called Prayer is Poetry, or part of a chapter, for you all to hear Ed's voice and also to get a sense of what this book is about. So welcome, Ed. And can't wait to hear your book.
Thank you so much. And can everyone hear me all right too with the, okay. Thank you for the tremendous introduction. It's very, very generous. And it's fantastic to be back on campus. I haven't been here for, I guess 10 years ago is when I took the class with Dr. Creech, I believe. So it was every day, I'm sure you guys have taken the class or something like it, but it was an intense summer, I will say. But it was great. So I'm going to read a few pages from this essay, Prayer is Poetry. I begin with 2 epigraphs because I love epigraphs. I always find it's like the cheater's way of beginning an essay. So the first one is, attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. It presupposes faith and love. And that's from Simone Weil, Attention and Will, 1942. And the next one is, I do not mean to deny the traditional prayers I have said all my life, but I have been saying them and not feeling them. And that's from Flannery O'Connor's Private Prayer Journal, circa 1946. Okay. Murmuring fills the stone halls of Mount Athos's monasteries, exhaling like breath into a cold and clear morning. With its thousands of monks, there is not silence. There is the opposite of silence. Excluding the sounds of nature, the cooing of turtle doves and the swooping of Dalmatian pelicans, the sound of rain hitting the granite paths of the Isle, the lapping of the ocean upon the jagged rocks, there is the omnipresent shudder of thousands of men's faintly mumbled devotions, called to prayer by one of their brothers hitting the metal of a semitron with a wooden mallet. Like chill dew condensed on green leaves still black before the dawn, prayer clings to the atmosphere of this place. Prayer is the ether of Athos through which light must travel. The din of monks chanting at every hour of the day and for all days is like holy cosmic background radiation. At the tip of that rocky peninsula, jutting like a limb into the wine-dark Aegean, are the 20 communities of the Orthodox monastic Republic of Athos, an outcropping that has been continuously home to ascetic, celibate, reverential monks for 18 centuries. There, overlooking the Greek Sea, sit buildings like the blue onion-domed mirage of St. Pantemilion Monastery, filled with Russian monks keeping their liturgy, and the Byzantine castle that constitutes the Stravinicta Monastery in honor of St. Nicholas. That holy bishop looks down on his novices with black eyes from gold icon. St. Nicholas is joined by companions such as St. Gregory, St. Nectarios, and the gentle Virgin of Theotokos, as painted by the great Theophanes the Cretan. In their otherworldly position, what do the icons see? There they watch scores of dark-robed monks who, with lips covered by black and gray and white beards, repeat the same prayer as if breathing over and over. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Such a process, the continual repetition of the Jesus prayer until it begins to lose coherence, in the same way that a continually uttered word begins to sound like nothing if you do it long enough, lends the words a different sort of significance. Any true hearing of the prayer has to consider the words beyond the words, gesturing towards that which exists beyond literal statement. Meaning is sacrificed for mystery, and in the process, an infinity is gained. Many who use this approach do so not just as a philosophical device for indicating God's utter transcendence, but also much more fundamentally as a means for attaining union with him through prayer, notes Timothy Ware in his classic introduction, The Orthodox Church. The spiritual cosmonauts who are Hesaists engage in this extreme repetitive prayer, chasing the literal semantic meanings out of words like souls departing from dead flesh, because such negations act as a springboard or trampoline whereby the mystical theologian seeks to leap up with all the fullness of his or her being in the living mystery of God, as Ware explains. As superficial attributes are burnt away, the sinner is to encounter the noble silence that is the core of all of us, the ineffable utterances of prayer. A process whereby those enraptured in the liturgy will subtract that which defines their externalities. A prayer so fervent that it will blind your ears, mute your mouth, and deafen your ears. That will blind your eyes, mute your mouth, and deafen your ears, sorry. This is prayer at its most extreme, absolute, indomitable, and unceasing. Philip and Carol Zaleski explain in Prayer, a History, that, quote, the roots of the Jesus prayer lie in the traditional belief that names contain power, and that repetition of a name concentrates and focuses this power, end quote. The famed utterance is based on these contemplative principles formulated within Eastern Orthodox Christianity, whereby the individual empties her soul out so as to make room for those diffusing molecules of holiness. In such a space, it is not just the spirit, mind, heart, and mouth that utter the anchorite's prayer, but indeed the elbow and ankle, the eyelash and earlobe, the knuckle and wrist also. Writing in the 4th century, writing in the 4th century, the church father John Cassian said that the Jesus prayer is to be one that you think upon, quote, as you sleep, as you eat, as you submit to the most basic demands of nature. You will write it upon the threshold and gateway of your mouth. You will place it on the walls of your house and in the inner sanctum of your heart. For if the Jesus prayer is narrative, it is one into which those who pray must descend. If it is a poem, it is one where the words themselves become indistinguishable from the reader, where the recitation becomes life. The Jesus prayer is not mere supplication. Rather, it's a variation on what Walt Whitman intoned in Leaves of Grass, whereby your very flesh shall be a great poem. When one transforms themselves into an evocation, it matters not whether we're speaking of prayer or poetry, for in heaven those categories are the same thing. Prayer is like poetry in that the greatest examples of both take as their greatest subjects themselves. All true prayers are about prayer. All beautiful poetry is really about poetry. Like all divine utterances, the Jesus prayer is also narrative and rhetoric, capable of being read critically. This is not to diminish the import of this celebrated Orthodox prayer. We must avoid collapsing the liturgical into the aesthetic, the profundity of ritual into the mere marketplace of art. But the Jesus prayer, all 12 words, 4 clauses, 3 commas, and 1 period that constitute it, wouldn't be as effective were it not also poetry, if it did not also have an endlessly regenerative story at its center, a script into which any penitent could imagine themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That passage for me contains kind of all of the different arguments that, kind of seem to circle around each other or hang together in a constellation in this book of essays. And one of the places I wanted to start was with what, to me, that chapter conveys is this sense of prayer as transgressive. And I think you do use that word at one point, and it made me think a lot about how in a culture that's as utilitarian and pragmatist and sort of obsessively materialist as ours, that prayer is something that doesn't fit very well. And so I wanted to kind of start there and ask you, how did you get to this rumination on this from your vantage point, not being a theologian, but being a literary scholar, writer, that kind of thing?
That's a great question, and I love this idea of, I think you phrased it really well, where you said that part of what's transgressive about prayer is it is sort of in opposition to the instrumentality of the world, or it could be, right? And I think what's so fascinating when we think about aesthetics, we think about literature or poetics in particular, is the fact that, obviously literature is very much a business in the real world, and publishing is a business, but writing itself doesn't necessarily have to be, right? And I think I'm very much interested in things that don't have an intrinsic purpose in a kind of bottom line sort of way, right? So I think that's what's so fascinating about the Jesus prayer, for example, is it's not a gimmick, it's not an advertisement, it's not it's not a theme park. It's something that's profoundly oppositional to kind of the gods of this world, the kind of gods of the marketplace or of politics or what have you. And I like the sort of radicalism of something that exists just to be, to a certain extent, right? And there's that great line, poetry does nothing, right? Is that Auden, I believe, who said that?
I can't remember.
I can't remember, but
I think maybe.
Yeah, and I think that it's such a funny, because sometimes that's read as a very cynical kind of, oh, you mean poetry can't change the world or whatever. And I think it's saying something that's kind of the opposite of that almost, right? That it's not a money-making venture, right? And I think that anything that kind of exists as an act of creation in that pure sort of sense, and not just of production, which is something very different, can have that kind of transgressive countercultural import.
Yeah, I was thinking about the the nature of performance. I mean, I've got this in some other questions too, but since
Sure.
you brought that up now, and that, so much of how we are invited to be in the world is very much performatively, where we're either rewarded or punished for how we perform, right? Whether that's grades, if you're in classes and getting grades, or in the, in jobs where you get a raise or don't get a raise, or you keep your job or you don't keep your job, all that kind of stuff, or even in social media where you're like banished out of Facebook if you say the wrong thing or whatever. So, or don't participate the way you're supposed to. So there's a way in which you are articulating something that, like, the monastics that you give as examples, they're not performing for somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of being unto itself, right? And I think that the example you give of social media is so perfect, right? Because it's sort of the reduction of people into products in and of themselves, and you're continually marketing yourself. And we all do it. To assuage anyone, of the purity of the business of literature, like, we're very much encouraged to promote and perform, because that's sort of the economic reality of the thing right now. But there's obviously a kind of a reduction with that, or something that at its worst, which is frequent, can feel kind of soul deadening to an extent, right? And the monks at like Athos. And I don't mean to overly romanticize them. Obviously, there's like a long history and a context, and there's whatever kind of problems and critiques people can have of that are legitimate. But they're not like, there's no like Mount Athos like TikTok account, right? Like, or I assume there's not. Someone's gonna like find it right now and be like, actually. And I don't mean to be curmudgeonly about it, but I think that the kind of prayer is practice for them as opposed to performance. And I'm interested in and like I love. Like, I'm not gonna lie. I love writing and having people read me and say, "Oh, well, we really liked your thing." Like, I like that. I obviously like that. But I think there's a purity to the production of literature at its best, where the experience at its best. Maybe not the best literature per se, but that the process of writing itself can be profound and introspective and contemplative and prayerful if done right.
This gets, again, I'm going to jump ahead to another question, but it's so interesting because I got my copy of Poets and Writers, okay? Oh. And in it, Ross Gay, who's also going to be teaching in the creative writing program soon in January, is interviewed here. And in his interview, one of the things that he talked about was about how he felt about grading and what grading does to students. And I was going to pull out something from this because he says things like, I'm no longer interested in someone submitting their poem or whatever to be scrutinized, which often really means shaving off all the weird edges, the stuff we don't yet know how to understand. I'm glad to ask good provocative questions of what we write, but I can't really stand how we used to submit our poems to the scalpels and hatchets of our classmates, many of whom, first of all, don't have a long relationship with the work they're hatcheting, and many of whom, secondly, are very new at this. They're like babies with hatchets, which is cute but very dangerous. It says Ross Gay. Oh, third, workshop is designed much like grading to encourage proficient, even highly proficient pieces of writing, good writing. The older I get, the less interested I am in good writing. I'm interested in writing that don't fit. Meaning, and then he goes on to talk about writing being linked to curiosity, the fount of wonder, and isn't curiosity born of knowing and cherishing the bottomlessness of our unknowing? And, somehow all of this seems connected to me, this notion of doing something that we're not trying to get anything for, and we're not trying to make it be something else.
Mm-hmm. I love that, and I think that's, the word that I would use for that is playfulness.
Yeah. Right?
Because play, if anyone has young kids or is familiar with children, like the play isn't, a child's not like, I am doing this to improve my eye-hand coordination and motor skill, right? Like there's a purity to that type of play that I think intellectual work and literary work and humanistic work should aspire to. And kind of I really liked what he had to say about the problem was shaving off all the weird parts, right? And one of the things, I come from an academic background where a certain degree of, accuracy, I guess, is valorized. And I don't mean to knock accuracy. I think truth is an important thing. But in my own writing, I kind of at a certain point realized that for me, if the choice was between being like correct versus being interesting, I'd rather be interesting, I think. And I'm not saying that should be a standard that everyone's. This is just for me, what I like, what I enjoy doing. And so when I write, a lot of what I do is I'm kind of like trying on an idea like I'd try on a jacket or something. And it's not necessarily something that like I'm staking out my ground for all time and like, this is my dogma forever. But it's just kind of playing with ideas to an extent and being like a little weird with stuff and seeing where that kind of takes you. Then is really what I prize in the experience. Is why I enjoy doing it.
And I think some of it for me is about when we write, we're our own first reader. So you're at first playing with your own mind. You're exercising and practicing your own ideas and trying to see what works and what doesn't. And the potential to entertain yourself in a positive way is there, which gets drummed out of us from an early age when, as Ross Gay's talking about, the grading beats it out of you, basically. Yeah. So you can't really have a good time just enjoying creating something because there's always some big stick on the other end if you don't do it the right way, And
I think there's a divinity to that type of creation. Like when you're really, there's a lot of writers I see, and they'll say stuff like they absolutely hate writing, and they don't. And I always, there's a George Orwell quote where he's like, no one would ever write a book if given the choice. And I was like, and I like George Orwell. I was like, well, then why do you write the book though? Right? Because there's any number of things you can do. Yeah. That are
the lawn.
Yeah, exactly. There's any number of like worthwhile, important things that you can do. I mean, for me, I very selfishly love the process of writing. I like writing a lot. And I think that, when people, and I think everyone is capable of this. I think that kind of need for evaluation or the requirement for evaluation and judgment, I do think it kind of drums some of this out of people. But when you're really in like the flow of writing, and not that everything you produce is going to be gold or whatever, but there's a type of heightened consciousness almost that can feel, it sounds corny to say, but it almost feels divine to a certain extent. And I think that one of the things that I try to get across with these essays is the kind of like innate weirdness of writing and reading. Like these are weird, and I'm using weird in the absolute most positive sense of the word. Think about what fiction is. Like you're making up fake people and fake worlds, and you're kind of spending time in that world, and that's like a strange thing. Or poetry, where we're playing with the sounds and meaning of words, and we're organizing them in particular ways, and they have an effect on people. You hallucinate whole other worlds, basically, right? And I think that some of that weirdness of reading comes across in writing too. There's something that's like a little mysterious almost when you're kind of like really in the flow of things, I think. And so some of what I'm interested in doing is kind of, honoring that mysteriousness.
Yeah, and that brings me to a question about the book. You're kind of staking out a claim for a kind of criticism that you call Orphic criticism. And as I understand it, this sort of prioritizes pondering the ways that literature functions as, you call it, incantation and conjuration, affecting alterations in our reality and or making whole new worlds, as you just pointed out when you read, a book, a piece of fiction, and all of this through language. So it's kind of a hermeneutic lens of sorts through, rather than a way of pinning things down or narrowing them down, it's a way of asking questions, I think. And I found that really interesting and also very neo-romantic of you.
It is, yeah, it definitely is. There's like a sort of inner
romantic
Platonist.
with a capital R for everybody. Yeah.
No, I definitely, and it was, so some of it, and when you read like the description of what I wrote, I was like, that is trippy as hell. I put that's a weird, but I think that, I don't know if I can say that in a seminary.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just checking.
We do study hell here.
That's true. I wrote a whole book about it. No, I think that one of the things that was frustrating to me when I was doing graduate work and I should say that like I loved a lot of graduate school, so I don't want to I'm not going to knock. I think it was a great process, and I learned a lot, which is ideally it's why you should go to school, obviously. And we talked about literature in a lot of really satisfying ways. So I don't want to have the kind of, because sometimes there's this sort of I'm going to come in against high theory, the kind of I don't like all this French philosophy. And I don't have use for those critiques per se, because I think that way of reading literature is powerful in its own right. But it was interesting to me that the very kind of blunt weirdness of literature that we all know about. Because I know when I describe the weirdness of literature to people, everyone knows what I'm saying. They get it, and there's a kind of basic simplicity to that weirdness that we obscure or that we ignore. I remember when I was first teaching, and this is 15 years ago, we were reading a third-person novel in a class, and I had a first-year student who said, "Well, who's narrating this story?" Because they were used to these first-person narratives or epistolary novels or whatever. I was "Well, what do you mean?" They're "Well, is it God narrating this?" And I was "Oh shit, is God narrating this?" I mean, I sort of thought that there was it's odd, and I'm always struck by this kind of almost anxiety about the weirdness of the kind of, and I love it, but it's strange. And so part of it is, and I think that this is sort of the reality of how higher ed is now, is things have kind of opened up. There's a lot of problems, economic problems in the system, obviously. But I also feel kind of freeing to be as freaky and weird as I want with that. And I sort of thought, thinking, what would it look like not to come up with a way of talking about literature that supplanted or replaced sociological readings of literature, or close readings of literature, or whatever, but just kind of, prioritize things like introspection and wonder. And it's not necessarily to produce interpretations of that literature per se, so much as maybe, I guess, to meditate on those particular things. And literature itself is kind of a strange thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and pondering along these lines, one of the things I thought about was another thing that I brought in with me, which is there's a essay in Toni Morrison's book, The Source of Self-Regard. It's the last essay in here called Invisible Ink, and in it she talks about the role of the writer to summon the reader. So she talks about that it's a kind of seduction of the reader, and you summon that reader into this world that you've created. So if you read her novels, there's this definite sense of being sort of brought into this whole universe in a particular kind of way. And then because you're luring, what she says, luring the reader into environments outside the pages. Mm-hmm. So this sort of hallucinogenic, like you're saying, but this idea of this whole world that you're being invited to inhabit. And then she says that the writer destabilizes the text in order to get to have the reader kind of not get too comfortable in a way. And then helps to reorient the reader toward this other reality that the reader hadn't considered before. And it's a very short little essay, but what's interesting is if you go and pair that with her Nobel Prize speech, she does that with these elite people when she goes to the Nobel Award ceremony. Is she tells this story, and it's to watch her do it, if you watch the film of it, it's almost like she's conjuring, you're talking about. It's amazing to me.
And I think it's, you're making me think about this sort of, this world that's beyond the page, right? So often in the kind of new critical orthodoxy, it's this sort of discipline of how we interpret literature that goes back about a century. There's this emphasis of you only refer to the words in the page, right? That's your sort of pool of evidence. And the way a lot of people actually talk about literature outside of the academy isn't like that at all. So how many times have you left a movie, you finished a book, and you're talking to a friend, and they say, "What do you think happened after that?" Right? Or something like that. And literally, well, nothing, because the book ended, and these aren't real people, right? Except the question makes sense, right? There's something about that question that I think still holds. And I was thinking about what was the word she used? Conjuring?
Well, I use conjuring. She says summoning.
Summoning, which is another, even a better word, I think, honestly, because conjuring has that kind of overly like illusory kind of feel to it, but summoning has this like deep kind of like Orphic magical kind of thing to it, connotation. And that when Faulkner used to be, and Morrison arguably is like the greatest reader of Faulkner ever, right? But Faulkner, they used to say that he would like be itchy to get back to writing because he said he wants to see what happens to like the Snopes' next, right? Like he didn't know, and it was a certain amount of like these are independent kind of like, I don't want to say spirits and get too weird, right? But there's something that seems almost conscious about them to an extent. And I wonder, like, with Morrison, I think what's so tremendous about her observation of that as well is that she's a profoundly religious writer, very Catholic writer too, which is oftentimes not, I think, given enough due credit. And I think that there's a certain willingness to embrace the mystery of literature that is a attribute of a writer like Morrison that is not always fully engaged with in kind of the wider critical world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that was actually one of the gaps I was looking to fill when I was studying her before I taught her work. And, she spent a whole, semester or something at Harvard Divinity School where they were studying her work. And they never asked her about her religious background or what was happening in terms of how she thought about that functioning in her work. And yet there are strands of both Christian theology in there and also of a sort of a African diaspora spiritual traditions that are knitted through. And they're extremely prominent. Like I read her work and I'm like, well, gosh, it's all over the place. But
Yeah.
It's ignored because of this division of the secular and the sacred, which is another thing that you seem to be trying to knit together in your work, is to say these things are not so separate as we have been talking about them.
Yeah, I'm very much, I don't know if I believe that like secularism's a thing, exactly. You know what I mean? Like I think that there's a lot of things that people think aren't religions, like actually are religions. And I think that a lot of kind of various theological structures kind of like secularize themselves into the wider culture. So I think that like an awareness of that is such an important thing. And that I think in terms of a critical apparatus to be able to just interpret things is so important to know. So that's definitely, that's like one of my rules is I'm like, when in doubt, something is probably a religion. So that's like, I'm not saying it's a good religion. I'm not saying it's a bad religion. I'm just saying when in doubt, I think that you can kind of see those themes of ritual and transcendence and community and liturgy and all of the different things, maybe not all of them in every single cultural manifestation, but I think that that's sort of, I think that rumors of God's demise have been like greatly overstated,
Well, that'll be music to the ears of the seminary crowd for sure. Because, this is one of the things I think from the theology side everybody's been hand-wringing about, which is that what's going to happen to all of this. Nobody wants to engage with it. And what you're saying is, well, they actually are, whether we want to name it that or not.
Yeah. And I mean, I think sometimes in the wider culture it could be arguably like a post-Christian kind of understanding or whatever, or even, I don't necessarily mean that everything's secularized Christianity or Abrahamic religion or something like that. But I think that, because religion's such a difficult word to define, right? Like it has, and it's a limiting word in some sense, which is why I think that oftentimes things that are literary are not interpreted as such, because I think there's a very historically contingent kind of understanding of what religion means that comes from a particular time and place. And that's why you get kind of in religious studies debates like, well, is Taoism a religion or not? Well, it's religious. It has attributes that are similar in some ways to things that we'd recognize as religion, but it's different in other ways, right? But I think that's just sort of, when you name something, you get a power over it, obviously, and that can be good and that can be bad. And I think that happens sometimes with how we limit ourselves with those definitions.
Yeah, and I think anthropology had a lot to do with that.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Deciding what religion was
Absolutely.
and what it wasn't. And, some of that was helpful and some of it was not helpful.
It's interesting you bring up, so there's a great writer named Peter Mansu. He's the director of religious studies at the Smithsonian. And he wrote a fascinating book about Thomas Jefferson's version of the Gospels, if anyone's ever read. So basically Thomas Jefferson took the Gospels and he took a scalpel to them and he cut out every interesting thing.
Yeah.
He was like, I'm gonna use my superior Enlightenment
Empirical
reasoning.
skills.
Exactly, and so it's like a 4-page book. It's like the Beatitudes, basically. And so Peter Mansu wrote this great, but it's part of Princeton University Press's Great Religious Books series. He gives kind of a biography of the Jefferson Bible, but it was like rediscovered at the turn of the 20th century. So it has this kind of like national treasure, like the guy's in the archive and finds it, but it was his predecessor at the Smithsonian like 100 years ago, so many, many years back. But this guy, he was I can't remember his name off the top of my head right now, but he was a religious studies scholar who was Jewish, and he was from Arkansas, which is like a double whammy there. And he put together an exhibit in which he combined things that were considered to be from like primitive cultures with things that were Christian, Jewish, and Islamic, right? So if he would be talking about physical manifestations of religion, like actual like sacred objects, he would pair something from like Native American culture with the Jefferson Bible. And it was something that was like super controversial in like 1900 whatever. But he was making a really important point that it's like, there's a physicality to religious faith that is common regardless of what tradition, what culture you're talking about. And that we tended to, like you said with anthropology, divide out, well, these are religions, but those are superstitions or those or whatever. And I think this guy at the Smithsonian, this scholar, was sort of suggesting something a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more humane to an extent.
That's really interesting. Well, let me see if there are questions either in the room or Bobby, do you have one from online? Awesome. Welcome.
I do. Any thoughts about the sermon as literature? Can it be literature? How to escape the production feel of the sermon and enter into more play? I'm thinking about how there are tons of people throughout the world working intently on this piece of writing every week. There are millions of writers all over the world who keep this practice of writing.
That's a great question. I love that. And I would say this is one of those great questions because I feel like I can give you a definitive answer without hedging. Like, absolutely. I think the sermon is a literary form. It's a venerable literary form, right? And some of this, my own academic training is in early American literature, so 17th century American literature, or as I call it, the literature that nobody reads. Whenever anyone's like, who are some of your writers? I'm like, I'm not gonna know. But part of it is you have to have, you develop a profound respect for the sermon as a form. And it's when, a sermon, and especially Puritan sermons, because they were so regimented in the order in which you would do certain things, right? But like a sonnet is regimented, right? I think that there's the regimentation is a great exercise in terms of like kind of regenerative capabilities. And the Library of America a couple years ago put out an edition of Great American Sermons, which if you've ever, Library of America is fantastic. They have these like gorgeous books that have like the acid-free paper that like when the rest of your library, like 100 years from now, is just like an acidy, pulpy mess, these books will still be there. But this is such a fantastic, it began with like John Danforth's Errand into the Wilderness and John Winthrop's Model of Christian Charity, probably one of the greatest works of 17th century English language American literature, entirely a sermon, but like, my God, the turns of phrase, we shall be as a city on a hill, which even if you don't know it, you know it, right? And it's obviously from the New Testament, from Matthew originally, but it's a tremendous literary form. And it's a theatrical form too, because it is obviously performed. So it's like rhetorical in the truest sense of that word. So I'm always, and if anyone ever gets a chance to just check this anthology out, it begins with that, and then you kind of move through, you have Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is a fantastic Gothic story at the end of the day. I guess he was a meaner Presbyterian, I think, than the guys. But I taught that for a while, and I said to students, I was like, this is, you can see the origins of Poe and Melville and Hawthorne in this. I mean, it comes directly from something like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. If you think about the English sermon writers, great English sermon writers of the 17th century, John Donne, the great poet, he was celebrated as a sermon writer for 4 centuries before anyone even bothered to look at his poetry. And the exact same stuff that makes his poetry work, his love of wit, his love of sort of metaphysical ingenuity, all of that is in, like the Death's Duel sermon. I mean, the guy, he literally preached his own, like, death homily, basically, in his funeral shroud. You talk about, like, performance. I mean, that's tremendous. But, I think for Donne, I mean, sort of the second part of that is how do you move beyond kind of maybe like a cheaper version of that, right? Like, I think that theatricality is such a useful way of thinking about, like, when Donne did that, it wasn't necessarily, it wasn't meant to be cheap at all, right? But it was meant to be dramatic. And he's definitely, he's a person who was attending the theater of Shakespeare's day. His son-in-law was Ned Allen, who's one of the greatest stage actors of the 17th century. And I think that sort of sense of self-fashioning and performance is artistry in and of itself.
So you're, in a way, sermon writing is about enjoying what you're doing. Like, I think that there, at least as I observe, there's a lot of anxiety around writing sermons. I mean, not only for students, but I think for a lot of pastors these days, where the fun's kind of gotten taken out of it. And so there's a way in which re-engaging with those authors seems to bring back the sense of play that you've been talking about, and maybe not worrying so much, just doing the thing and doing it well and trying to enjoy it.
And I should be totally upfront. I mean, I've never written or delivered a sermon. So this is a little like getting advice from me about architecture or something. This is like totally theoretical. But I definitely, I do get the impression from the people who I named that there was a sense of play with it. I mean, Donne, if you ever get a chance to read any of Donne's sermons, I mean, they're tremendous, and they're stern because it's the 17th century, but he's John Donne, so he has like a very kind of a physical, sensual kind of relationship to these ideas as well. So I think with him in particular, there's a sense of like intellectual nimbleness that's very playful. Or another, Lancelot Andrewes, which, chef's kiss for a name. That's an amazing name. But Lancelot Andrewes is one of the great Anglican sermon writers. And his language is so Byzantine and lush and kind of purple. And he's clearly an author who loves language. So I think I think the font of any really good poetry is, at the end of the day, a love of language itself. And he clearly loves the sounds of words and the rhythms that they can make. And I think being able to kind of maybe, engage with that.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That's getting away from that overly utilitarian way of treating language. Anybody else have questions here? I have more, but I would love to give the microphone over to one of the rest of you if you would like to ask Ed something. Anyone? No pressure. Just want to make the space open. Come on up.
Hello, my name is this on?
It should, yeah, Bobby should.
My name is Charles Hudson, and actually I'm Shan's partner, so just full disclosure. But I'm interested in the question that was asked online about people all over the world that are writing sermons every week, and how that connects to your writing of writing for the sake of writing, and that being for the writer, and being salvific, rejuvenating, redemptive for the writer, and how, in taken that way, that's a contemplative and a monastic process that walks you into your own inner reality and your own prayerful life, and not checking the boxes to just keep up with the congregation or to keep up with the liturgy or what you have to do on the calendar. And how that solitary process of writing for the sake of writing can be salvific for the audience. Like if the person writing the sermon is not having that experience, how can they convey that possibility to the audience? The connection between the audience and the writer, and doing something for something's sake, not just for the audience.
I think that one of the things that I've always, I guess two different answers I can give to this that are related. They're not contradictory answers, but part of what I think about with writing that is part of the mystery of writing is frequently I won't know what it is that I'm writing about till I actually do the writing itself. And I think that's one of the things that makes writing a kind of unique activity. Is it seems like there's something, it's either within you or beyond you or whatever, but it's not totally conscious. And the writing itself kind of brings that out. And I think that's the kind of contemplative aspect that is so important for it. In terms of the idea, and I think it's an important one, right? It's an important question, is if somebody's not feeling it when they're writing something, right? Like how do we ask the audience for them to feel it, right? And I think, we have a concept in literary theory. It comes from Roland Barthes, from the literary theorist, called the death of the author, which probably you guys have heard of before. But the idea basically was that, like, and I'm super simplifying this, but you can read a text, or you should read a text almost independently of who produced it, right? That like the text is kind of like its own thing. And a lot of people have interpreted that over the years as like a kind of anti-humanistic sort of thing. And I take it in a different way. I think that we can think of the words as having a power and a significance beyond who wrote them or who produced them, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of the example I always give with my students. Again, I feel like I keep going back to these like first year writing things, but if I was in like the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., the Shakespeare Library, and I found Shakespeare's journal, which like happy day that would be for me, and I find that he writes something like, you know what, Hamlet doesn't mean anything. I wrote it real quickly. I didn't care about it. It was just to get paid, and I don't even like it, right? I asked him, I was like, does this change how we read Hamlet? And my argument is no. Why would it? It doesn't matter. I mean, Hamlet's bigger than Shakespeare is, right? And I think that people can write things that they themselves don't even like, and it can still have a power and a significance to it. So I think, for the minister, the pastor who's not feeling it when they're writing the sermon, that doesn't necessarily mean that the audience won't feel it either, right? Like I think that giving oneself a bit of charity, because writing is hard, it is a craft, it is work. You don't always feel it. I've had things that I've written that I'm like, this is garbage. And I go back to it and I'm like, no, you know what, it works. And I was like, I don't know why, I don't know how it happened. But I think that the messenger's not always the message, kind of is the way I would take from that. I don't know if that was like total word salad or not.
No. And that, I mean, can I ask one more? Yeah. I heard a lot of what you were saying when it was washing over me, and I was listening to it, contemplating it. Very apophatic, very emptying, going through the unknowing process and the curiosity, the wonder, the mystery. And also just wondering what you might offer as support or recommendation or caution to the writer, be it a sermon writer, literary, academic, to not, going through the process of reaching that creative impulse and that perhaps authentic, solitary unknowing, how not at the same time to undermine the institution, whether it's a religious institution or higher academy, that is moving along a line of secular adherence. And how do you bridge being in that institutional and secular machine of church or higher academy or employer or whatever, and live that mystery and the unknowing and the curiosity to show up as purely yourself as you can and be empty and apophatically ears open, listening to the still small voice, perhaps.
I always think that, I guess, the way I square it is I kind of try to reorient myself to think that you're sneaking the mystery and transcendence into the other world. Do you know what I mean? Like instead of thinking that the other world, that the kind of things of this world are contaminating us in this way, think that we're kind of like, bringing as like little sparks these things out into the wider world. I don't know if that's super satisfying, but that's how I try to, because it is funny, the business aspect of it is definitely, it's there, and
It's just as much art, symphony, mystery as anything else.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, so I know we've got to wrap it up, but I was thinking a lot as I was reading your book about the role of solitude, which kind of threads into some of what Charles was just saying in terms of being a writer and a reader. That there's a way in which developing a healthy respect for solitude, again, in a world that is demanding so much of us to be externalized. The process of reading and writing actually allows us a chance to have an interior space that we often are not allowed. We are just not allowed it. And so I found that to be a little, like there were just times when in the book where I saw you sort of flagging that. And I found that to be really helpful because I've been doing a lot of contemplation of solitude myself lately.
And I think that that's one of the radical things about reading in particular and writing is because it has to be done ideally in this kind of, you close yourself off into like an atom of space in which to do this. And I've always, I don't know, this is one of my like examples, I think, of something that's maybe more interesting than correct, but I have this idea in which like the rise in literacy and the rise in reading was instrumental in people thinking of themselves as individuals in some way. So I don't know, in Confessions, there's that scene where Augustine sees Ambrose reading silently, and that's actually and he's like amazed by this, right? That's one of the first instances, and this is about the 3rd, 4th century, of somebody referencing internal reading. Before this, people tended to read everything out loud, and that's in part because stuff was scripto-continuous, so like there were no spaces between words, and it was hard to do. So you'd have to kind of like mouth stuff out loud to yourself. So if you were in like a medieval scriptorium, the monks would all be kind of like murmuring as they did stuff. But apparently Ambrose could just like read like how we read. But Augustine was amazed by that. I mean, he gave that as an example of Ambrose's brilliance. And I think that one of the things that's so powerful about reading is if you do hallucinate this own world, you can do it in a profound privacy, right? If you're sitting on a bus and you're reading Crime and Punishment or something, you're in 19th century Russia and nobody knows that you're there. And it's like a kind of space to itself. But the thing, and I don't mean to be like the anti-technology guy, and I'm completely addicted to my cell phone, which is why I'm saying this, because it's like a reminder to myself. But that's like the opposite of interior reading, because you're reading all the time. If you're on Twitter, you're literally looking at letters continually, but they're always in conversation with other people all the time. And you kind of decide the way it goes, or you have the illusion that you do, but you don't have the kind of giving yourself over to like a novel or a poem where you're at the command of this other entity, this other thing. And I do worry about the kind of what happens to us, I think. Well,
and I know we got to finish, but there's a way in which that reading a book sort of stokes energy, whereas I find reading social media drains it out of me. And it's such a weird dynamic, but that's part of the issue with solitude that I've been thinking about is how it really doesn't work the same. Yeah. And it's not because the screen's like pulling my eyeballs out of my body or you know what I'm saying? But there's just a way in which engaging that way doesn't really give me the same feeling of, I don't know what it is exactly, except a fullness or richness or something. It's just a very different reading experience.
I've always said whenever I'm like on Twitter too much. The way I get myself off of it is I say, I'm not going to be on my deathbed and go, I really wish I'd spent more time on Twitter. Like, it's not going to happen. And I think you're right. It's just it depletes you in some way, or at its worst, it certainly does. And I don't get that from. It never feels immersive, but it feels permeating, if that makes sense. I don't know if that difference makes sense, but that's what I see it as.
That's interesting. Well, I wish we could keep talking. I really do. And I want to say to our audience here, thank you so much for joining us today. And to those who are online, thank you also for joining us. Those who are online, be sure to check out the chat for links to the Barbour Library's LibGuide and to booksellers where you can purchase Ed's book, Binding the Ghost, as well as his other books. I want to thank you to the library and to Bobby and the IT for all that you do to make this happen. We will be back here in person on Friday, November the 11th at 5 for a book talk with PTS faculty member Dr. Kimberly Rusaw about her newest book, Revisiting Rahab, Another Look at the Woman of Jericho. And I want to thank you so much, Ed, for your book and for being here. It's really great to meet you in person. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank everyone for coming today. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everybody, and happy reading and writing.
Thanks.